Around 2400 BCE, new people arrived in Britain. Within generations, those already living there were gone. Britain had been inhabited for over 6,000 years by Neolithic farming communities who transformed the landscape. They built Stonehenge and dozens of other megalithic monuments. They cleared ancient forests and planted crops from one end of the island to the other, establishing permanent settlements connected by trade routes that spanned hundreds of miles. Then, a group of people crossed the English Channel carrying distinctive pottery shaped like upside-down bells. Archaeologists call them the Bell Beaker people. DNA proved they replaced almost everyone. The Bell Beaker culture spread across an enormous geographic range between 2800 and 1800 BCE. The distinctive pottery has been found in archaeological sites from Portugal to Poland and from Morocco to the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, making it one of the most widespread material cultures of prehistoric Europe. For decades, archaeologists debated what the spread of Beaker pottery actually meant. Did the pottery spread through trade and cultural exchange, or did actual people move, carrying their culture with them? In 2018, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted answered that question definitively. The study was led by Igo Olalde at Harvard and published in Nature in March 2018. The team sequenced DNA from 400 ancient individuals buried across Europe, spanning over 4,000 years of prehistory. It was the largest archaeogenomic dataset ever assembled at that time and represented a collaborative effort between dozens of research institutions on 3 continents. They extracted DNA from the dense petrous bone behind the ear. It preserves ancient DNA better than anything. The results for Britain were staggering. Nothing in the archaeological record had prepared anyone for what the DNA showed. Within just a few centuries of the Bell Beaker arrival, approximately 90% of the genetic ancestry of Britain had been replaced by continental newcomers carrying steppe-derived DNA. The genetic shift was not gradual. On the analysis plots, Neolithic and Beaker populations occupy completely separate spaces, 90%. In genetic terms, that is not migration. That is replacement. No other migration event in British history comes close. The Anglo-Saxon migration replaced roughly 40%. The Beaker migration replaced 90%. The people who built the great Neolithic monuments of Britain were almost entirely gone within a handful of generations. The transition took roughly 200 to 300 years. In archaeological terms, that is astonishingly fast for a population turnover of this magnitude. The question is obvious. What happened to the Neolithic people? How do you lose 90%? The Neolithic communities of Britain were not primitive. They had farmed the island for millennia and built sophisticated monuments. Avebury, Silbury Hill, the West Kennet Long Barrow. These communities organized labor on a massive scale and maintained complex social networks across the British Isles. They were established, they were numerous, and yet the DNA record shows they vanished. The researchers considered several possible explanations. None of them are comfortable. The first hypothesis is violence. The Beaker people may have conquered the Neolithic communities through warfare and forced displacement. The Beaker migrants had access to metal technology. They brought copper and early bronze tools. The Neolithic communities used polished stone tools. The Beaker arrivals carried metal daggers and specialized archery equipment, including stone wrist guards. But the archaeological record shows surprisingly little evidence of warfare during the transition period. Beaker burials appear alongside Neolithic burials in the same landscapes. The archaeology looks gradual. The genetics do not. The second hypothesis is disease. A plague or epidemic may have devastated the Neolithic population before or during the Beaker arrival, and there is real evidence for this. Yersinia pestis has been found in Neolithic remains across Europe. In 2019, researchers published evidence of plague in Neolithic European populations, dating to around 3000 BCE. If plagues swept through Britain's Neolithic communities before the Beaker migration, the arriving population would have encountered a dramatically weakened and depopulated island. An empty landscape would explain how newcomers replaced the existing population without leaving evidence of conflict. The third hypothesis is demographic competition. The Beaker people may have simply outbred the Neolithic population over time. The Beaker communities practiced mixed farming with a heavier emphasis on pastoral herding and dairy. A pastoral economy with dairy can support faster population growth than grain farming alone. More calories per acre with less labor. The most likely answer is all three combined. Plague weakened the population, Beaker migrants arrived, demographics finished it. This three-phase model explains both the genetic data and the relative lack of warfare evidence in the archaeological record. The Olalde study also revealed something surprising about where the Beaker migrants came from. In Iberia, Bell Beaker pottery spread without significant genetic change. The people stayed the same, but adopted new pottery styles through cultural contact. In Britain, the opposite happened. The pottery came with entirely new people carrying steppe-derived ancestry. The British Beaker people were genetically descended from Yamnaya steppe herders, who had migrated into Central Europe several centuries earlier. The steppe ancestry that replaced Neolithic Britain did not arrive directly from the Pontic steppe grasslands of modern Ukraine and southern Russia. Instead, it passed through Central Europe over several hundred years in a stepwise migration, mixing with local Neolithic farmer populations along the route, but retaining its dominant genetic signature throughout each successive generation of movement westward. This means the people who built Stonehenge were genetically unrelated to the people who later used it. The Neolithic Britons who erected the Sarsen stones were almost entirely replaced before the monument was finished. The earliest phase of Stonehenge was built by Neolithic communities. The later phases were maintained by Beaker people who inherited a monument built by a population they had replaced. The study also examined what happened to the remaining 10% of Neolithic ancestry. The Neolithic contribution did not disappear entirely. A trace survived in every subsequent generation. Modern British people still carry approximately 10% Neolithic farmer ancestry embedded in their genomes. That fraction has remained remarkably stable for over 4,000 years, persisting through every subsequent migration event, including the Anglo-Saxon and Viking arrivals. Every person in London today carries DNA from both the Stonehenge builders and the people who replaced them. The Beaker replacement has a deeper implication that extends well beyond Britain. The same steppe-derived ancestry that replaced Neolithic Britain also transformed the rest of Northern and Central Europe during the same broad period. The Yamnaya expansion is now considered one of the largest demographic events in human prehistory. Nearly half the ancestry of modern Northern Europeans derives from steppe herders who expanded westward roughly 5,000 years ago. Was not unique. But the scale of replacement in Britain was among the most extreme anywhere in Europe. The most famous individual from this transition is the Amesbury archer. He was buried near Stonehenge with extraordinary wealth. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed he grew up in the Alpine region of Central Europe. He crossed the entire continent to reach Stonehenge. He was not a refugee. His grave goods mark him as a man of exceptional wealth and high status. A man from the Alps buried beside Stonehenge. That is what the Beaker migration looked like. The Olalde study also revealed patterns in how the replacement affected men and women differently. Y chromosome data showed an almost complete replacement of male lineages. The paternal lines changed entirely. Mitochondrial DNA showed slightly more continuity. Some Neolithic maternal lines survived into the Beaker population at low frequencies. Male lineages replaced almost entirely. Female lineages showed some survival. That pattern has a specific demographic meaning. Incoming Beaker Men married some Neolithic women, but Neolithic men had almost no reproductive success afterward. Whether this happened through violence, social exclusion, or economic competition is impossible to determine from DNA alone. The bones can tell us who survived. They cannot tell us why. The Beaker replacement also coincided with the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age in Britain. The entire social structure changed. Neolithic Britain emphasized communal identity with collective burials and shared monuments. Beaker Britain emphasized individual status with personal grave goods and individual burials. This was not just a genetic replacement. It was a complete cultural transformation. Language likely changed too. Most linguists believe the Beaker migrants brought an early form of Indo-European language to Britain. The Neolithic language of Britain left no written trace and no identifiable descendant language anywhere in the world. Whatever the monument builders of Stonehenge spoke to each other, it died with their genetic lineage and was replaced entirely by the Indo-European speech of the Beaker newcomers. The 2018 study fundamentally changed how archaeologists think about cultural change in prehistory. For decades, the dominant theory in archaeology was that pots spread through culture, not migration. Alauda proved that in Britain, the pots and the people moved together. The DNA rewrote the textbooks. Britain's population history was far more violent and dynamic than anyone assumed. Today, millions of visitors come to Stonehenge every year. Most assume they are looking at the work of their ancestors. Genetically, modern British people are more closely related to the Beaker migrants who arrived around 2400 BCE than to the Neolithic people who built the monuments they visit today. The builders of Stonehenge are not the ancestors of modern Britain. The people who replaced them are. 90% of a population replaced in 10 generations. The DNA does not lie about the numbers. What it cannot tell us is how it felt, what the last Neolithic communities experienced as their world disappeared around them. Their monuments survived. Their genes mostly did not. And the island they shaped was inherited by strangers. The same channel crossing that brought Neolithic farmers 6,000 years ago later brought their replacements. Britain's story is one of repeated replacement. Each wave builds on what the last one left behind. 400 ancient genomes. One clear conclusion. The people of Neolithic Britain were replaced almost entirely by migrants from continental Europe in the span of a few centuries. The monuments endured, the people did not, and the DNA recorded every generation of the transition. Stonehenge still stands, built by one people, inherited by another, visited today by the descendants of the replacers. 90% replaced. The DNA proved it. The archaeology missed it for a century. 400 genomes told a story that pottery and stone tools never could. They lived on the same island. They are buried in the same soil, but they were not the same people. The land remembers what the people forgot. The DNA remembers what the land could not. If this story changed how you think about ancestry, subscribe. The bones always have more to reveal.